Great. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Rick Hanson for the Global Compassion Coalition, here with my co-host, Rachel Ebanks Gold, interviewing my friend and someone who has been a person that I've leaned on in my own mind since we started the Compassion Coalition about a year and a half ago, in the first glimmer of a notion, Dr. Marcela Matos. And thank you, Marcela, for doing this. Rachel will read your bio and your own background and accomplishments are much larger than the length of the bio, and then we'll just really dive in. So, Rachel.
All right. Well, hello, Marcela. Hi, Rick, and hi, everyone watching. So Dr. Marcela Matos is a clinical psychologist and auxiliary researcher at the University of Coimbra's Centre for Research in Neuropsychology and Cognitive and Behavioural Intervention in Portugal. And with a 15-year focus, her work explores evolutionary clinical psychology, compassion therapy, behavioural interventions, and contemplative methods. She has extensively studied compassion, shame, and traumatic memories, delving into their impact on mental health and personal identity. Currently, her research centres on compassion-focused group interventions, investigating their effects on well-being, epigenetics, and stress responses. And Dr. Matos boasts over 80 international articles covering psychopathology, emotion regulation, and well-being across diverse populations, and also actively contributes to compassion-focused organisations globally. So welcome, Marcela. I'm really excited for us to have this conversation. I think it's going to be very interesting and very helpful to delve into your research into compassion. So thank you for coming. To get us kicked off, I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your background and maybe how you came to be interested in compassion.
Hi, hello Rick, hello Rachel, hello to everyone who's watching from Portugal. I'm streaming live from Coimbra, right in the center of Portugal, where I live and work at University of Coimbra. It's a pleasure to be here, so thank you for the invitation. And about my path towards compassion, I didn't start off looking at compassion, but when I look back now, I can see how my personal and also my research paths, my research journey were always intertwined and eventually led me to this interest in studying compassion. But I first started with shame. So my journey to compassion started with shame, and that has had a personal side to it. So my own experience of shame throughout life, and that led to a particular interest that I had when I decided to do my PhD in looking at shame and shame experiences and how they could have such a pervasive impact on our lives throughout our whole life. And so from that research, in which I focused for many years, the question that began to emerge in my mind, and as I interviewed hundreds of people about their shame experiences, was what actually can protect people against shame, what can heal shame, and why is it that for some people, given that we all have these shame experiences, why is it that for some people these shame experiences become highly pathogenic and impactful throughout their lives, whereas for others there seem to be some kind of protective factors that buffer against the impact of these experiences. And this is when my interest in research-wise sprung in relation to compassion. Because in my own life that had been my learning as well, how compassion had been so transformative and so important and protective in my own life.
Well, thank you for all that, and including grounding it in your own personal experience. Thank you. One thing that has struck me about your background is how, and your work, is that you locate it in this frame of biological evolution, right? Human beings have walked the planet for about 300,000 years, another couple million years before that of ancestors who made tools, and then before that, primates, mammals, and so forth. So in that long journey, what are the results of that long journey that are relevant to shame and compassion, for example? And how does it help us to situate those challenges and those opportunities in a larger biological framework?
Yeah. Um, Thanks, Rick, for that question. Compassion in evolutionary psychology, and according to the approach that guides my work, which is compassion-focused therapy, is seen as a universal and innate human motivation, a human pro-social motivation that is central to the evolution and the survival of our species. This human motivation seems to have evolved throughout the process of evolution of our species over millions of years, and it has contributed to the survival of our species until today. So our capacity for compassion seems to be rooted in a combination of an innate motivation that we have, that we share as human beings, to care and to be cared for by others. And we share this motivation with other mammals. So this motivation is ingrained in the deepest parts of our brain, and we share it with other animals, with other mammals. And alongside this innate motivation that is rooted in the most ancestral parts of our brain, there is also a set of human abilities, human competencies that are unique to human beings, and that have evolved as human beings throughout human beings' evolution as a social species. So as we continue to evolve, we also began to face important social challenges. So for all human beings, it is very important to be valued by others, to be accepted by others, to be chosen by others, so that others want to be our allies, our friends, our partners. And this is central to shame, because this is where the potential of shame lies, in this importance of us human beings being valued by others, being esteemed, being cared for by others. So when that is threatened, or when there's a possibility of this being threatened, that's when shame emerges. And it's also in similar abilities that are related to our capacities for empathy, for metacognitive awareness, for intentionality, for knowing awareness. It's in all of these social, emotional competencies that are unique for humans. So in this combination from our capacity to care and these innate also human competencies for social and emotional understanding, that our capacity for compassion seems to lie.
That's so interesting. Yeah. How does, so I'm curious, so I can imagine compassion flowing inward toward oneself, buffering self-criticism, and easing the shame spectrum from profound feelings of worthlessness and despair about who you are through the range of feelings of inadequacy, social comparison, guilt, remorse. And here we're distinguishing between appropriate remorse about something that helps us walk a higher road next time, to pathological levels, problematic levels, excess, unnecessary suffering, if not also dysfunction levels, right? Shame, guilt, remorse, so forth. How does compassion directed inward help with that? And then second, wild card question here. I'm wondering, to what extent does compassion for others help to nurture oneself and maybe over time become a basis for an inner healing of oneself, in part through giving compassion to others?
So there's a lot of research over the past 10, 15 years showing that when we are able to develop, either through our life experiences or later in life through the formal cultivation of compassion and directing of this compassion inwardly, when we're able to develop this capacity to be compassionate towards ourselves, we are more able to approach, tolerate, accept our own missteps, our own what we perceive as failures, as setbacks, what we perceive as the possible source of shame, of self-criticism, with compassion. So with this non-judgmental, accepting, wise, courageous, and committed attitude towards ourselves and towards our well-being. And a very important point, I think it's worth strengthening here, is that compassion gives us the courage to be able to face the parts of ourselves that either we don't like, or that have been rejected by others, that we would like to push away. So compassion gives us the courage to approach suffering, our own inner suffering, in an open way, in an accepting way, but also in a wise way. So how best can I help myself face, address this suffering, address this difficulty? And also another important aspect is this caring commitment quality of compassion. Compassion is about action towards helping to alleviate suffering, but also to prevent suffering and further harm to ourselves and to others. And so in response to your question, Rick, the research has unequivocally established that self-compassion is an antidote to shame and to self-criticism. But it has also shown that our ability to receive compassion from others, or the experience of receiving compassion from others, can also be key to soothing these negative effects of shame and self-criticism. When we look at the research that is out there, this is what I would say seems to be most significant. When we talk about compassion to others, we also know about the important effects that being compassionate towards others has on our own well-being and mental health, even though these effects are not as straightforward as the effects of self-compassion. And this is because we've found, when we look at this research, what we find is that because we have these different flows of compassion, we can direct compassion inwardly, outwardly to others, or we can receive compassion from others. This also means that people can have actual different abilities, different levels of these different flows of compassion, so that they can be, for example, very good and able to be compassionate towards others, but they can, for example, struggle with directing compassion towards themselves.
Yeah.
So it is important to distinguish between these different flows of compassion and identify in which of these three flows do we struggle more. So what is exactly the aspect, the flow of compassion that perhaps we can work a little bit more on towards opening it up and embodying this part of ourselves.
So you're getting at compassion as both an innate capability, which is great news. We don't have to scratch and claw up to the top of the mountain, right, to have it. On the other hand, it's also something that can be strengthened and as a trait inside us, and the applications of it, the expressions of it also can be strengthened and encouraged. And I'm very interested in your research, and then I know Rachel will pick up the thread here, specifically with the way that compassion protected people during COVID, right? And you've also studied it with regard to the stressful, I can speak from personal experience, transition to parenthood, although that was definitely a ways back down the highway of time for me. What have you found specifically are benefits of compassion practices in dealing with stresses such as a plague, COVID, and also stresses of transitioning to parenthood?
As you were just saying, Rick, thank you so much for that point. Thanks to the neuroplasticity of our brains, we are able to cultivate this innate ability that we have within ourselves, regardless of how our lives allowed us to develop it or not. So research across the world and our own research in our research center has focused on also the impact of compassion-focused interventions and practices. So can we cultivate these competencies, and what is the impact of doing that? So we've focused on that for the past 10 years, I would say. And so we found in different populations, general community population, but also clinical populations, that when we purposefully cultivate compassion, that can have a tremendous impact on our mental health and well-being. So when we cultivate compassion, either through briefer interventions, so we have done it with, for example, a community population, general public population, across only 2 weeks of compassion practices, daily compassion focused practices. But we've also done it in longer format interventions, for example, 8-week compassion interventions. And in both cases, we've found, both in the briefer ones and in the longer ones, that when we try to cultivate and practice compassion, that can have an effect on improving and increasing our compassion motivation, competencies, and action towards ourselves and towards others. It also has a tremendous effect a significant effect on reducing our fears of being compassionate towards others, but also towards ourselves, and of receiving compassion from others. It can improve our ability to experience positive affect and to feel socially safe and
positive
connected.
Affect is a technical phrase for happiness and other
and
positive emotions. Yeah, keep going.
And flourishing as well, and well-being. And at the same time, it has this effect on reducing psychological suffering. So on the one hand, compassion can improve our well-being and human flourishing, but it can also reduce psychological suffering and human suffering. And in these studies, we found, for example, that these compassion-focused interventions have a significant effect on reducing symptoms of depression, of anxiety, stress, of burnout, for example, in teachers, of experiencing threat emotions at work, of feeling threatened and disconnected from others in organizational settings. And it can also have these type of interventions can have an impact either in a briefer format or in a longer one on our ability to physiologically regulate stress. So on our heart rate variability, which is an indicator of our body's ability to emotionally adapt and regulate environmental challenges and experience interpersonal safeness and intrapersonal safeness as well. So this is one side of the question, right? So how
the general
can
benefits.
Yeah, the general benefits of cultivating compassion in different populations and with through interventions with different formats. But we've also tried to understand these benefits of compassion when facing a specific challenge, and in this case, a universal threat such as the COVID-19 pandemic. So this project, this COVID-19 and Compassion project is a multinational project that is still ongoing. So we are still looking at the data. And the idea for this research began right in the early stages of the pandemic in March 2020, when in the face of these invisible, these unprecedented, and what seemed to be a universal threat back then, a question popped into my mind, which was, we have never faced anything like this in our modern times, in our modern civilization. So can compassion, can social connection protect us against the harmful effects of this global threat on our psychological and social well-being? So this is what we set out to do. We established a multinational consortium of 23 countries from around the world that brought together 44 researchers, international researchers from around the globe, with interests and work on compassion, on the compassion science field. And so we began this project, which has been a longitudinal project. So we have collected data throughout the pandemic across 5 time points. And what we found out so far, the research, we've published a few papers now from this big multinational project. And what we found was that when we look at data across these 23 countries around the world, and when we account for differences between these 23 countries in their levels, in participants' levels of compassion, of depression, of stress, of even the differences between the countries in their measures, the lockdown measures, the governmental measures to prevent the spread of the virus. Even when we account for all of these differences, compassion, in particular, self-compassion and receiving compassion from others, have a universal protective effect against psychological distress, so against symptoms of depression, anxiety, and stress in this context of the pandemic, but also against, for example, post-traumatic stress symptoms on the one hand, and they also seem to protect against experiences of social disconnection and loneliness, which we know were an important aspect and an important factor of immense suffering in our populations throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. So we found this universal protective effect of compassion and of social connection against the pervasive and the toxic effects of the pandemic globally. And these effects were consistent across the countries where we studied, where we conducted this study.
those are really powerful findings.
Wow.
And as you know, better than I do, psychological experiences such as stress and loneliness can in turn be factors of physical health problems. So possibly the benefits of compassion in our psychology might even cascade, through the body itself, particularly during a time of stress. And so I just wonder also, transition to parenthood, and maybe more briefly on this part, just what have you found there that compassion can help people with?
I may perhaps we have this has been so I have not conducted any study yet, so that's not
Oh, for
my
parenthood. Okay, great. I misunderstood
no
that.
no 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 we have an ongoing project
Yeah.
on that, but we don't have data yet that I
Oh,
can
okay.
share with you. So I
That's
have
good.
my
A real
personal
scientist
experience.
here. Very good.
I have my personal experience of transitioning to parenthood,
Yeah.
but research-wise, we have an ongoing project that is
Oh,
part of a big project that we have, bringing compassion to schools.
yeah.
That is focused on parents, but we don't have data yet from that study. I'm afraid that I can share.
Marcela, you've spoken about a wide range of like psychological benefits in terms of our well-being, and this idea that actually, yes, there's an innate compassion within us, but we can also grow this. But I was wondering, are there any particular sort of blocks to both receiving compassion? So if we are, on the receiving end of compassion, but also giving it to ourselves and also giving it to others. Are there any particular sort of blocks to those?
Yes, that's a very important question, Rachel, because when we try to cultivate compassion, a very important aspect that we should not forget or minimize are what we call fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion. So fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion are considered to be the major inhibitors of these or of the development or the enactment of this innate compassion motivation that we all share. And it seems that we can develop these blocks, these resistances, these fears of compassion throughout our lives, through personal experiences, by watching our parents, our role models. They can also be ingrained in our culture and in the communities where we live and where we are educated, and so we can acquire these fears of compassion, and they are mostly related to aspects related to how we see compassion and how we believe that compassion can be threatening to us. So that compassion is a weakness, that we, for example, can become more vulnerable if we become too compassionate, that others can abuse us if we are compassionate, that, for example, we are not deserving of our own compassion, or that others would not be compassionate towards us if they actually knew ourselves, knew us, and deep inside, and knew our faults. So these fears, these blocks to compassion, can exist in any of the flows of compassion. So we can be fearful of being compassionate, and that blocks to compassion, to directing compassion towards ourselves. So we can be fearful of being self-compassionate. We can be fearful of being compassionate towards others because we may believe that others are not deserving of our compassion, for example, or we don't know how to be compassionate towards others, or we may be afraid of the consequences of if we become too compassionate towards others, will they become, for example, too dependent on us? These are some of the things that people bring up when we talk about these fears. And we can also be fearful of receiving compassion from others, of becoming overly exposed, overly vulnerable, or too dependent on others, for example. Or that others can abuse us if we open ourselves to their compassion. So it is very important to both when we talk about the therapeutic setting, but in our own lives, in our own personal experience of our relationship to ourselves and to others, to be attentive to these possible fears, blocks, or resistances, because it can be that we are fearful, but it can also be that we don't know how to do it, and we can learn how to do it, or that this emerges from myths about what compassion is, and the risks of it, and we can then inform ourselves a little bit more, for example, about it, and learn and study a little bit more about that. So it is important to identify these fears, these blocks to compassion, and address them. Because if we don't do that, if we only, what our research has shown with this implementation of these compassion-focused interventions, or our research, for example, with the COVID-19 multinational study, what we've found is that if we don't identify these fears, if we don't address these fears and actually work with these fears to reduce them, then it is going to be very hard to be able to work on what facilitates compassion. So actually work on the competencies and cultivate these competencies of compassion. For example, in our COVID-19 study, we found that fears of compassion, so being fearful of directing compassion towards ourselves and of receiving compassion from others, but also of being compassionate towards others, was a key magnifier of the impact of the threat of COVID-19 on our own mental well-being and experiences of social safeness. So those people who were more fearful, who had more blocks about being compassionate, they were at higher risk of experiencing psychological distress and feeling disconnected and socially unsafe.
Wow, fascinating. And I was curious, in terms of if you become aware of that there is a block, and maybe you understand that maybe you are fearful of taking that compassion in, is that awareness alone sort of enough to kind of like start to dissolve that fear, or like are there specific things that we can do to kind of more than just being aware of them?
Yes, there are specific things we can do. So the first step is we cannot change what we cannot acknowledge. So the first step is cultivating this mind awareness and cultivating this ability to, in a non-judgmental way, look inwardly and identify our own fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion. And from that, we can start to address these fears, these blocks, and resistances. One of the things we can do is think about and try to understand what is the origin of these fears? Where do they come from? Now that I've noticed that I have them, where do they come from? So this is an important step, and try to understand how they actually, throughout our lives, they probably have an adaptive function. So there was a specific moment in our lives that we learned this for a particular reason. But posing the question, do these fears still serve us? What is the function of these fears in our current life? what do we think they are protecting us from, actually. And then there are little things that we can do, and that is approaching, as with anything that we are afraid of, we should work towards opening ourselves to it and approaching it gradually. So one step at a time, so we can try to understand where do we feel these fears or blocks more acutely, and imagine that it is regarding being compassionate towards myself. So in order to work with that, I can think about how can I approach this in a gradual way. So first, I would cultivate in my own body my ability to activate soothing emotions, feelings of safeness, and experiences of safeness that don't necessarily have to be directly linked to compassion, but we know that they are related to it. So we would tap into this ability in our own bodies to self-regulate through the activation of these soothing and self-soothing abilities. We can cultivate mindful awareness and mindfulness, and then from that we can see how can I start to direct compassion towards myself. Maybe, for example, first using imagery practices, and then starting to incorporate those practices into daily life and into behaviors, how to embody this compassion towards myself in my life.
Awesome. So first up, sort of not being judgmental of yourself, which I think is really important, because we can judge our self-judgment or judge that, especially if like compassion is quite a new thing to us and we hear all the benefits, sometimes we can then be like, oh, well, I'm not very compassionate to myself, and judge ourselves for that. And that's like a block to compassion itself. So
Exactly.
that's a really good point. And that curiosity about where does it stem from? So I was curious in terms of like practices that maybe you personally find beneficial or that you've found throughout your research that maybe some of our viewers can start to practice or look into.
Yes. So my response to that is going to be twofold. So in terms of research, I will first tell you what my research has taught me, and then I will tell you about how that also informed my own personal practice, which in a way also informed my research, to be honest. Throughout all these years, my personal practice also informed my research on this. So we, in the research that we've conducted, we have also been interested in exploring what are the key components of the compassion practices that seem to be crucial to cultivate these competencies and to address these fears of compassion. And so what we found is that there seems to be two sets of practices. The first set of practices are what we call the practices where we cultivate in the body the qualities that we need in order to cultivate compassion in our mind, in order to nurture this innate motivation in our minds. And these body-based practices are practices that involve our breathing. So we call it soothing rhythm breathing, which is a particular type of breathing where we try to slow and deepen our breath in a particular way in order to activate our vagal nerve and our parasympathetic nervous system, and through that cultivate a sense of groundness, of calmness and contentment in our body and in our mind. We also consider that cultivating mindfulness and mindful awareness, and mind awareness is key. So mindfulness-based practices are also very important to the cultivation of a compassionate mind. And then we work, when still talking about these body-based practices, we work with facial expressions, postures, voice tones, in particular inner voice tones and inner facial expressions, and the importance of our posture when we try to embody these qualities of compassion, and we are trying to when we are trying to cultivate these qualities. So this I would say would be the body-based practices that in our research we found to be key to the cultivation of compassion. And then we have another set of practices which are imagery focused practices and embodiment focused practices, and these involve cultivating this sense of safeness, of inner safeness, through imagery, but also of developing our own compassionate self-identity, what we call our compassionate self, our compassionate mind, through the cultivation of these qualities of wisdom, of courage and strength, and of caring commitment. And then practicing directing this compassionate self and using this compassionate self to address suffering within, so towards ourselves and towards others. And then I would also say that another important aspect to this that our research has shown was that we looked at what actually are the aspects of the practices, of what are the qualities of the practices that are related to change, that are actually related to improvements in well-being, in mental health indicators, in our ability to cultivate compassion. So what we found was that even more than how often we practice these formal practices, which is important, but more important than how often we practice are two things. The fact that we are able to recognize why these practices are helpful, and can be helpful to us. And more importantly, is our ability to embody these teachings, embody these practices, these competencies in our daily lives. So this can be, of course, something that seems very common sense, but our research has documented this empirically, because until then, research has had mixed findings regarding the importance of practice frequency. And what we found was that, yes, practice frequency, the frequency in which you practice is important. But if that stays in your cushion, and you are not able to embody that into your life, when you're facing feelings of shame, of sadness, when you're faced with your own self-critic, or when you have a conflict with someone at work, or when your child throws a tantrum at you, or a friend disappoints you, or you see someone on the street that needs help, or when you watch the news and you feel helpless because you don't know what to do in the face of so much suffering. So if we are not able to, when actually life challenges us, to use these teachings, and actually we are able to embody compassion, then it's not enough to sit and practice. It is crucial to harness this power of compassion and use it in our lives.
Wow. Yeah, so what you do on the ground in real life, bringing practice to real life is the key.
Yes. So when talking about my own personal experience, so I have tried to develop throughout my life a regular formal practice, which I maintain every day. So I try to practice what I preach, and that happens because I found in my own life, in my relationship with myself, and in my relationship with others, the transformative effects of doing this practice. So I do these formal practices every day. So I do mindfulness-based practices, breathing practices, and compassion-focused imagery practices every day, along with my beloved yoga and Pilates practice. So I have a mind-body practice every morning when I wake up at 6:30, and that sets me off to my day. I also try to be in contact with nature, so that I found that very, very helpful. So walking in nature and just not losing sense of our place in the midst of nature and our connection to the world around us. And then, maybe I think more important than any of this is that I try to remind myself to do not let this sit in your cushion, Marcela. And I try to bring this into my daily life, in particular when it is most difficult. So when I'm struggling with my own difficulties, or when I'm having a conversation with someone that has been challenging, when in the face of the multiple stresses that life throws at us every day, that's when I experience and when I believe that this ability to embody what you try to cultivate in your cushion. So when you try to embody this wise version of yourself, this strong, this courageous version of yourself, this committed version of yourself to not turn away from suffering, but face it, learn to lean into suffering, to tolerate the uncomfortable experiences that arise when we are with suffering. And then, what can I do to help? And these can be very simple things that we can do in our daily lives to others, people that we know, people that we don't know, but also to ourselves. And I would say that the key thing here is not close our eyes to suffering.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got 10 minutes left, 10 or so minutes left. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about the Compassion in Schools project, because you mentioned compassion in terms of burnout in teachers. So I was curious to hear more.
Yes, so over the past few years, we've been developing an international project. So this project has been being developed in collaboration with the UK, with the University of Derby in the UK, and with Professor Paul Gilbert at the Compassion Mind Foundation. And the main aim of this project is to cultivate a compassionate, resilient, pro-social, encouraging environments in our schools that counteract the individualistic, competitive, threat-focused environment that so often we witness and we see cultivated in today's schools, not through the fault of teachers or of parents or of pupils, but just this is how, when we look at our world, how many times things are happening around us. So we set up to do this project, and we've already conducted several studies implementing this compassion-focused intervention with teachers. In the UK, they have also started to do this with pupils, and we're also doing it with parents. And what we found, in particular with teachers, is that we've conducted pilot studies, feasibility studies, a randomized controlled trial, and all of these results have been published. So what we found is that when teachers undergo this compassion-focused intervention, an 8-week compassion intervention, this has significant effects on multiple well-being indicators and mental health indicators. So teachers disclose that they are more able to direct compassion towards themselves, but also towards others, which is a distinctive aspect in relation to other interventions with other populations. So with teachers, the effect of the intervention seems to happen not only in terms of cultivating teachers' own self-compassion, but also their ability to be compassionate towards others in their own personal lives and at school. It also seems to improve teachers' experiences of social safeness in general in their life, but also their experiences of safeness in the school. So how they feel connected and safe in their own school and connected to their colleagues, to the pupils. We also found that this compassion cultivation in teachers has another very interesting effect, which is it is able to activate and improve teachers' feelings of vitality, energy, which seems to be key because we know that teachers suffer a lot with depressive symptoms, burnout symptoms, emotional exhaustion, physical exhaustion. So not only this intervention seems to be able to cultivate experiences of safeness and feelings of safeness and positive this drive, this activation of our drive system, our willingness to do things, basically. And then we also found that cultivating compassion in teachers seems to have an effect in reducing their depression levels, their levels of stress, of their levels of fears of compassion, their own self-criticism, and also burnout in teachers. And at the same time, we found significant increases and improvements in heart rate variability, which is so in our physiological ability to regulate stress. So in teachers' physiological ability to regulate stress. And
oh, great! That's great. Sorry, I was just excited about what you were saying. As Rachel noted, we're kind of coming to the top of the hour. And so I wanted to ask, if I could, 2 questions sort of succinctly for you. One of them comes from, Wafula at just a little bit past the hour in the chat. And then a related question coming, I don't have good Spanish at all. Anyway, just came in. Where can people, from Mexico, where can people find examples of compassion practices? So to kind of combine them, let's suppose that a person, me, is feeling anxious and unhappy, and maybe part of that's angry at myself. Concretely, what would I do inside my mind if I were self-compassionate? What could another person do if they were experiencing that? How would they be self-compassionate toward themselves? Maybe.
So thank you for the question. I didn't get the name of the person who asked that question.
Oh, it's Wafula.
Thank you.
From
Wafula. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Wafula, for your question. So a first step is noticing. So developing this ability to be aware of what's happening in our own mind. have this mind awareness about these shame feelings or this self-criticism voice within ourselves, and then cultivate this. For example, use soothing rhythm breathing in order to be able to better tolerate the negative feelings and emotions that come with this shame or with this self-critical voice within ourselves, and then start to and try to cultivate this other part of ourselves, this version of ourselves, our compassionate self, as its own, as a self-identity on its own, and use this self-identity. So through the eyes of this self-identity, through the body of this compassionate self, how would we relate to our shamed self? How would we relate to our critical self? What is actually behind our critical self? What is our critical self trying to protect us from? What is our shamed self trying to protect us from? How can I direct compassion towards that? How can I develop some kind of understanding, of acceptance towards that? And what can my compassionate self now do to help that part of myself? What can be helpful in this moment? What else? What is the different? What is the alternative response to, for example, a mistake or a setback? A response that comes from this part of me, from my compassionate self, instead of my critical self or my ashamed self or my anxious self, for example.
Beautiful. Applying to yourself the kind of wise caring that you would bring to a friend, let's say, or a child,
exactly,
or someone who's really suffering. Yeah, and then shifting the relationship. The anxiety may still be there, the sadness may still be there. There may be a realization that there's a lesson to learn that you've been criticizing yourself about, but the relationship to all that becomes much kinder and balanced and big picture oriented and supportive. That's
exactly,
beautiful.
Rick. Beautifully put.
Oh, from you. I'm going to be the voice of the audience for a couple quick questions here. So it came in from Maribel in Mexico. Where can we find examples of compassion practices that we can practice on a daily basis? I'll just jump in by saying in part that Alex Wilkes, our webmaster who's hiding in the basement here managing things, as well as Matt Hawkins and others, have put up a beautiful list of compassion practices on the Global Compassion Coalition website, including some in multiple languages or besides English. So beyond what we have on the GCC website, Marcela, where can people from around the world find examples of practices they can do on a daily basis?
So I was going to mention the Global Compassion Coalition resources, but other than that, I would say from this approach, so from the compassion mind training, compassion focused therapy approach, so the practices that I was mentioning today, they can be found at the website of the Compassionate Mind Foundation UK. And we also have them for those of you who speak Portuguese. We also have them in Portuguese, and you can reach out to me if you'd like to have this resource for your life.
Well, that's wonderful. And then coming in from, we have a really international audience here, coming in from the Jemima in the Philippines, I think, maybe. Do you facilitate training with counselors across the globe and offer certification to validate the practice of your approach? Is this project extended to Southeast Asia, such as the Philippines?
So thank you so much, Jemima, for your question. So training in this type of intervention, compassion focused therapy, compassion mind training, can be done through the Compassion Mind Foundation UK. They have a program of training with different levels of training in order to develop this expertise to implement compassion-focused interventions like this. And I'm not aware that I'm not sure if Jemima was referring to the COVID-19 project or the schools project, but as far as I know, no, but there is definitely a possibility. So if there is an interest on that, we are looking towards expanding. So this Compassion in Schools project is ongoing and is being expanding to other countries around the globe. And Philippines can be one of them.
Beautiful.
Amazing.
And if you'll permit me a last question here, I'm again so struck first by the internationalness of the audience, and second, the internationalness of many of the issues in the world today. And the challenges sometimes in having compassion for the suffering of those that we disagree with. Because as you know, compassion is independent of agreement or approval or even liking. So maybe you could take us out here to the wider world as we finish. Your wish for humanity altogether to be able to have more compassion for those on the other side of the line, on the other side of a conflict, on the other side of the world. I think you might be muted. There you are.
I'm so sorry. I was coughing, so I was trying not to not to hurt our audience ears with my cough. What I would say is that I truly believe this. I truly believe that compassion is our human superpower. I believe that we can all learn to be more sensitive to suffering in ourselves, in others. We can learn to develop the wisdom, the courage, the commitment to do what is necessary to try to prevent suffering or to alleviate it, and to behave in ways that are helpful rather than harmful to others and to ourselves. So I think I will leave you with a question, which is a question that I try to pose myself every so often. How can you, in your own lives, in your relationship with yourselves, in your relationship with others, how can you harness this human superpower that is compassion? How can you, with wisdom, with courage, with caring commitment, use this power to help transform, even if just a tiny little bit, the world around you and the world within you?
Thank you. What a
Beautiful.
profound question that will echo in my heart, and I'm sure in others. Well, thank you, Dr. Professor Marcela Matos, and
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone
Thank
for
you.
participating.
And thank you everyone around the world that was here. And thank you so much, Rick and Rachel.
Beautiful. Well, we will finish formally now. We will stick around a little bit when we are no longer live. Thank you again for everyone. And may Marcela's beautiful wish and beautiful question ripple out into the world in ways seen and unseen, benefiting all of us. Thank you a ton.